There is a skull in a museum in Atapuerca, Spain. It is 430,000 years old, and it has two holes in it. Both holes are in the same spot. Both were made by the same weapon. Whoever held that weapon swung it twice. This is the oldest known evidence of one human killing another. The first thing researchers noticed was not the violence. It was the repetition. One blow can be an accident. Two blows to the same spot is a decision. We tend to think of violence as something that crept into human history late. Something that arrived with civilization, with territory, with inequality. Archaeological record disagrees. The evidence for interpersonal violence in early human populations is older than farming, older than cities, older than weapons designed specifically to kill people. Which raises a question that is genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. Did something go wrong with humans? Or did killing serve a purpose? The honest answer is both, and understanding which is which changes everything about how you think about violence today. Start with the biology. The human brain contains a structure called the amygdala. Its job is threat detection. When it perceives a threat, it triggers a cascade of hormonal responses. Prepare the body for fight or flight. Within milliseconds, this system is not uniquely human. Every mammal with a limbic system has a version of it. What is unusual about humans is what sits on top of that system. Prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, consequence evaluation, and long-term planning. In most situations, the prefrontal cortex can override the amygdala. It can say, wait, think there is a better option. The problem is that this override is slow. It takes time, and in the specific conditions that early humans lived in. Time was sometimes the one thing they did not have. Researchers studying interpersonal violence across cultures found that the triggers are remarkably consistent across every society they examined. Resource competition, perceived insult to status or reputation, threat to a partner or offspring, retaliation for a previous act of violence. These four triggers account for the overwhelming majority of human violence across every culture and time period ever studied. They are not modern triggers. They are ancient ones, and in a world without courts, without police, without any formal system for resolving disputes, produced a very specific kind of violence, fast, personal, and almost always between people who knew each other. The idea that ancient humans lived in peaceful cooperative bands until something external corrupted them is not supported by the evidence, but neither is the idea. Early humans were in a constant state of war. The truth is more complicated and more interesting than either version. Anthropologist Lawrence Keeley spent 20 years analyzing the archaeological evidence for prehistoric violence and published his findings in a book called War Before Civilization. What he found was that the rate of violent death in prehistoric populations, adjusted for population size, was significantly higher than in most modern societies. Some sites showed that up to 15% of skeletal remains bore evidence of violent trauma. At a site in South Dakota called Crow Creek, archaeologists found the remains of nearly 500 people who appeared to have been massacred within a single event. Around 1200 years ago, bones showed evidence of scalping, dismemberment, and intentional mutilation. This was not a war between states. There were no states. This was one group of people deciding to eliminate another group of people entirely. Here is the critical piece that changes the interpretation. The same archaeological record that shows this level of violence also shows something else. Evidence of healing. Broken bones that were set and allowed to heal, indicating that the injured person was cared for by others. During their recovery, skulls with healed trepanation wounds, holes deliberately cut into the skull, what appears to be an early form of surgery. Graves with objects suggesting the deceased was mourned and buried with care. The violence and the care are not contradictions. They are two outputs of the same social system. The key word is group. Early human violence was almost never random individual aggression. It was almost always group structured. You defended your group. You competed with other groups for resources. You enforced norms within your group through the threat of violence, and you extended extraordinary care to members of your own group, including the injured and the vulnerable. The same cognitive and emotional systems that produced violence also produced its opposite, because both were strategies for group survival. This matters because it tells us something important about what violence actually is at its evolutionary root. It is not a malfunction. It is not a disease. It is not evidence that humans are fundamentally broken. It is a strategy that emerged in specific conditions, specific purposes. The conditions were scarcity, competition, and the absence of any external enforcement system. Purpose was group survival, and for most of human history, it worked well enough. The groups that used it survived to produce the next generation. The problem is that the strategy does not scale. It works in groups of 50, does not work in civilizations of millions, and humans spent most of their evolutionary history in groups of 50, which means the neural architecture for violence was refined and selected for in a context that no longer exists, but the architecture remains. Now here is what gets truly dark. Researchers studying the specific conditions that predict violence in both prehistoric and modern populations found a pattern that holds across both contexts. The uncomfortable consistency. Violence spikes during resource stress, when food is scarce, and water sources are contested, when the environment shifts in ways that reduce available resources. Rates of interpersonal and intergroup violence increase sharply. This has been documented in the archaeological record, in historical records, and in modern conflict data. It is one of the most robust findings in the entire field of conflict research. What this means is that violence in humans is not primarily a product of culture, ideology, or individual character. It is primarily a product of pressure, specifically resource pressure, the specific ideology or grievance that any given group uses to justify violence against another group is almost always a proximal cause, a story told on top of a deeper material reality. Deeper reality is almost always competition over something that feels scarce: land, water, food, status, safety. Archaeological evidence from the transition to agriculture, particularly striking in this context. For most of human prehistory, the rate of violent death was significant but relatively stable. Approximately 10,000 years ago, as humans began farming, something changed. Violence spiked. The sites associated with early agricultural settlements show dramatically higher rates of traumatic injury and violent death. The hunter-gatherer sites that preceded them. Farming created surplus. Surplus created inequality. Inequality created the conditions, kind of organized violence, that nomadic hunter-gatherers rarely experienced. Not the quick personal violence of a dispute between individuals. Organized, strategic, group-against-group violence, aimed at taking and holding resources. This is not a comforting finding. It suggests that the very development that most people associate with the beginning of civilization, agriculture, stable settlement, accumulated wealth, also created the conditions for a qualitatively new and more destructive form of human violence. The killing did not start with civilization. Civilization made it worse. And yet, the same transition that produced organized warfare also produced something else. Law. Formal systems for resolving disputes without violence. Contracts, courts, institutions specifically designed to take the enforcement function that violence had always served, to replace it with something that did not require anyone to get hurt. The history of human civilization is, among other things, a long, slow attempt to build systems that make violence unnecessary, providing alternatives for resolving the conditions that produce it. Those systems are imperfect, they are incomplete, fail constantly, and in ways that produce catastrophic violence. But they exist. The fact that they exist at all is evidence that the same species capable of the skull in Atapuerca, capable of Crow Creek, capable of every atrocity in the historical record, is also capable of deciding that there has to be a better way, and then actually trying to build it. The two holes in that 430,000-year-old skull, not evidence of what humans are. They are evidence of what humans do under specific conditions. The question that has occupied researchers, philosophers, and legal systems ever since is whether those conditions can be changed. The evidence suggests they can. It also suggests we have not changed them enough. That the skull in Atapuerca is a warning that has been sitting in a museum for 400,000 years, waiting for someone to take it seriously.